Thank you for inviting me. My name is Deacon John Wilkinson, and I've been at St. James maybe, I don't know, 25, maybe 30 years, something like that. Not as long as Marty, but I've been there a long time, and we just celebrated last year 185 years at the same location, and the church building itself was built in the 1850s, and it's on the National Registry of Historic Places. And along with the church comes a cemetery, and I'm sure a lot of you locals here have heard many stories about all the hauntings and the ghosts and all this kind of stuff, and I can tell you, all the years I've been there, I haven't seen anything. Maybe some couple of coyotes, but we still have these people coming out looking for the paranormal. Anyway, to begin with, I got quite interested in our cemetery. What's been written about it over the years has been kind of sketchy. The records have been sketchy, and we're still doing burials there. And occasionally people come and they want to buy a plot there. Well, there hasn't been any plots available since the 1980s. Everything is sold. And I would surmise maybe in about the next 10 or 12 years, it'll be filled up. There won't be any more for sale. And we'll talk a little bit about that as I move along here. And here's kind of an aerial shot here. And this is much in the tradition of you'd find in Ireland, where you have the gravestones alongside the church, and we pretty much sit right inside the church that we haven't visited the site. The church itself was built in a period in the 1850s, and over that time from the 1850s till about 1900, it went under many renovations, such as the later addition in the 1890s, the bell tower was added, and the bell, and a roof was pitched, and you can somewhat see right here there's buttresses on there when they were building the canal, the sanitary ship canal out here. You see it running along there. They were using dynamite, so it was shaking the ground, so they put these buttresses on the church. But it's still an active worship site. There's still masses going on there, and it's still a parish. And we are the oldest parish in the Archdiocese of Chicago. We are the oldest church building in northern Illinois. There's one in southern Illinois that predates us, which is founded by the French Catholic. So we are the oldest active church building in northern Illinois. And to take a look at what's in our cemetery, I call it the silent majority, because the vast majority of the people that are buried in the cemetery have nothing to do with St. James. St. James, over a period of time, was the Irish cemetery. And a lot of the Irish that were either working on the canal or later would come out from the south and west side of Chicago, and they would bury their dead out here. Many of the interments, the funeral masses, came right from here, from downtown Lamont, many from St. Patrick's. Quite a few came from St. Patrick's. So, but there's not just Irish in the cemetery. It's a pretty mixed bag. However, the majority, you read the tombstones on there, are Irish. And there's Murphy and Sullivans all over the cemetery. And none of them are related to each other. And occasionally you'll find some other ones that are, I don't know what they are, but it's quite interesting. So the cemetery itself is laid out, the rectory is here. It's laid out on an east-west axis. east-west axis. So this here would be south, this would be north, this would be east and west. Interesting enough, everybody that's buried in this cemetery faces east. When we had the Mass before Vatican II, the Tridentine Mass, and the priest was in the back here, he also faced east. So he was leading his people. The belief is the risen Christ will come from the east. Also, when we wheel somebody in here for a funeral, and wheel the casket up the aisle here, his feet are at the front, his head is at the back. He also is facing east. And that's a tradition. And it's not true in every parish because of the proximity of the parishes. This axis idea may not work. This area back here where you don't see anything boxed in over here, this area here, and in the front here is the pulpit section. And we estimate there's somewhere around 500 people buried in here. We have no idea how many people are buried at St. James. It's 5,000, it could be more. Occasionally, I suspect that the boundaries go beyond the fences into the forest preserve. In fact, recently we uncovered a plan from 1914 where it doubled the size of the cemetery and went way beyond going east. So that's a good question. If you look in the corner, there's even a well right in the corner there, Mark. Back in there in the days before the washroom, we still don't have a washroom in the cemetery. There used to be an outhouse. Maybe Marty remembers. There used to be an outhouse back over here. This area here is wooded right now. Oh, okay. And then of course this goes down the hillside here to 107, so it gets quite steep. And occasionally one of the vaults might start popping out, sticking out as the ground erodes, and so they have to come in and fill it in. Interesting enough, it wasn't until the 1920s, by law in the state of Illinois, you had to use concrete vaults. So the early interments, you would just put a wood box in the ground, and that was it. And if you do, like I have done in my own family, tracing my family history, you go to some cemeteries, especially the secular cemeteries that are privately owned by families, and that the upkeep on them sometimes is questionable because the money's only rolling in when there's interments taking place. Catholic Cemeteries has perpetual care, and they do a wonderful job. Catholic Cemeteries, by the way, in this diocese has 44 cemeteries. It's all under one umbrella now. 44 cemeteries and 9 golf courses. And the 9 golf courses are future cemeteries. But the idea of perpetual care and taking care of the grounds, the parish up till the 1980s under Father Asher was reluctant to surrender the control of the cemetery of Catholic cemeteries. But they take care of all the maintenance, the upkeep, they do all the interments there. We do occasionally have a funeral mass here. Many of the burials that come here, they come from other places because the plot itself may have been passed down. It's been a long time since we buried anybody right out here in the front. In fact, it was under Father Bahula back in the 90s. Was the last time we buried anybody right outside the door. Yeah, you can go and bet that. No. So, and then there's the nice little story, I don't know how true it is, but all this stone that was carried up to build a church came from the quarry on the other side of 107. And the story is that the families that carried the most stones up got to get the graves that were closest to the cemetery, to the church itself. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I can tell you this, that Bozak, who's a descendant, her grandfather, Murphy, had donated half the land. The Sullivan family and the Murphy family donated the land for the parish and for the cemetery. And she had lived to the ripe old age of somewhere in the late 90s. And we had buried her husband, he was 97, and she was quite distressed because he's buried down here along the fence. And she said, my grandfather said that all the Murphys, they would all be buried up around the church here. And then they tell me there's nothing left. And we have to go all the way down there. And I said, well, you know what your problem is, Jenny? And she says, what? I said, you live too long. That would be down there if we were the rest of them up here. But she was probably the last really connection we had to active parishioner, to the two donors, the Sullivan family and the Murphy family. But as it stands right now, there's nothing to buy here. People come all the time and inquire about it. Occasionally, they've done inventories over the years to see if somebody, they've lost track of someone here or something here. Of course, there's going to be some that are never used. People have bought them, and there's no connection. And when I mentioned earlier about perpetual care in the old days, the way they would take care of a cemetery, in fact, under Father Aschenbrenner, up until the 1970s, he would keep track of the descendants of the graves, and then you would pay a tax every year for the upkeep here. And you can see how long that's going to hold together, because as people move on, you lose track of them, and that whole idea fell apart. Occasionally, when we go to do an interment here, they come out there with an iron rod and they poke in the ground to see if there's anybody there. Once in a while, they do find somebody else, but we don't know that served as a record keeping under certain periods was sketchy at best. We did find, right up in here, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, there was a whole one side here, they were all buried on the wrong side of the headstone. So they had to open up a big hole and move everybody over. And you could see the vaults in the ground, and there's a special kind of vault they use in this cemetery. There's very narrow walls because they're so tight. I mean, you couldn't put a piece of paper between the two vaults. That's how tight they are in there. And how they do this, you know, under dirt and everything without seeing things, it amazes me. But in the wintertime, it can be kind of challenging. And right around here, there's a little stone building here. It looks like a little garage. And I don't know if many of you remember, in the old days, when somebody would die, and it's January or February, the ground has frost in it, and it's like concrete. You can't dig on it, and you can't bury anybody. In a lot of cemeteries, you'll see an old building, and that was a holding building. They would put the deceased in there over the winter months and hold them all in there till the ground thawed out. Now, what they do now is they put a big metal box over the section where they're going to dig out, and they heat it with propane and kind of get the frost out of the ground so they can do the interments. That's quite a, so most of this is all filled in here, and the current burials are all back here along the fence. And I think, Marty, your family is, you're right along the fence there, aren't you?
Just about out of the fence.
In the swamp area there, aren't you, Marty? I remember years ago, I was way back in here. We're doing an interment back in here. And the Catholic cemetery, the cemetery digger says, hurry up. He says, we keep pumping it out and it keeps filling up with water. So, anyway, my grandfather was right when he always said, go to the high ground. Go on high ground. this has been kicked around for I don't know how long. Who's the oldest one? Who's the oldest interment there? We don't know. But this is a stone that at one time had stood up. Most of the old stones, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You know, they just erode, and there were tall, skinny ones, depending on the era. The stones all tell a history itself. But this is a Michael Dillon. We can't tell if it was 1816 or 1846. So, but that's thought, and that's right alongside the north side of the church building. And digging around, I found a few interesting things. And just for example, this Martin Murphy, he died in 1952. He says the first cemetery was in a place called Haytown, about 2 miles southwest of Athens, which is Lamont, many of you know. Many remains later moved as the quarries expanded, many unrecorded burials. And this just happens to be a little picture here I put up of a marriage license from 1910. And the pastor at that time was Vincent Brummer from Austria. And this is from a recollection. The first burial for St. James at Sag was a Mrs. Ring, who had lived in a small cabin in Archer Road just east of Carroll's Corner. Carroll's Corner is right next to the entrance at St. James. That was in about the year 1850. And I remember the funeral because I saw it on my way to school in a log cabin. Cemetery land was granted to the church at the Saginaw by James Murphy and John Sullivan. And to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what the organization was like in the cemetery, it's thought that in the 1820s, early settler burials may have already began. And this is that recollection about Mrs. Ring. James and John Sullivan Murphy deeded 8 acres to Chicago Diocese, and confusion over free burials persists. Some say that Mr. Murphy said that, the land was free to anybody that wanted to be buried there. You could come out and claim a stake. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. And then in 1882, Father James A. Bowman, and he was our first resident pastor. Up to that time, around 1882, we didn't have a resident pastor. So anarchy prevails with the burials. And right now our webpage is undergoing renovations, and I did put up a lot of newspaper articles that I found from this time, and it talks about all the drunkenness and fighting that was going on in the cemetery because it was up to the families to dig the graves, and sometimes the alcohol would, as it said in one article, it would rear up in them, and they didn't get the job done. And then he would have to eventually pay somebody to come and finish the job. So, and then Vincent Brummer, under his watch, the burial records are at best sketchy. And Father Aschenbrenner, he arrives on the scene in 1970, and he works to organize and maintain the cemetery with limited resources. Now here's a man that arrives on the scene he's 50 years old, somewhere around 50, 51 years old. Catholic Cemeteries is on them by 1980 to start consolidating the cemeteries under one umbrella. And he was reluctant to turn over the records, reluctant. He wanted to keep control of that cemetery. So by 82, he kind of gave up the fight. And just recently, Sacred Heart over here in 111th, they were the last parish, if you know where their little cemetery is, the little postage stamp, they were the last ones to give up their cemetery to control Catholic cemeteries. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, you're like, well, by that time, you're already 60 years old when you're there, and they want to come in and take, I would go here and take it, it's less for me to worry about, right? But he tried to reconcile the records, he tried to keep things organized there. Some say that you'd go in his office, and he had a map with all the names on it, and who was buried where, and he kept it rolled up in a window shade in his office. He'd pull it down. And I do have a lot of correspondence from him sending out letters for people. This is your last chance to buy a land here before I surrendered the records to Catholic cemeteries and they take over with their new policies. A lot of times, members of the parish that did a lot of work, a lot of volunteer work, he would reward them with a couple of graves in the cemetery. And many of those people are in there today. Barney, what'd you pay for your plot in your back in about $500?
I thought it was like 600, I think.
For the two, right?
I'm not quite anymore.
Yeah, probably thousands now, right? Yeah. And then in 1986 to the present, the consolidation of Catholic cemeteries took place, and the idea of perpetual care. And it was good for St. James because now we don't have to worry about the cemetery. They take care of keeping the grass cut, any maintenance needs that are in there, and that. And what happens in this perpetual care idea, it's okay as long as there's interments coming in and you're selling graves. There's money coming in. After that, the only money that's coming in is when you do an interment, when you open a grave. Other than that, there's no money coming in anymore. So you can see in the secular cemeteries, when they were family owned, there's still a few left in Chicago that are family owned. And it gets, some of them, they've sold off parcels of their land for strip malls and shopping centers as areas get populated. But it's hard to get things rolling there when there's not money rolling in. And I can say with the Catholic cemeteries, they do a wonderful job of maintaining the integrity of the cemeteries, including the record keeping. And you saw that disaster that was on TV a few years ago, where there was that mess of Burr Oak, was that mess. So, you know who bailed them out of it? Catholic cemeteries. They came in there, they called Catholic cemeteries, they had to come in there and organize it and get the record keeping straightened out. I've been over to St. Cashmere Cemetery, if you've been down there in 111th, that was at Pulaski, I can't remember.
Yeah.
Down there, that's the place I'd want to go. I'll tell you, it's like a golf course there. They do a wonderful job. And you know, I mentioned earlier about cemeteries, about the idea of using concrete vault. And the reason was, because as the casket decays, the ground starts sinking, it starts moving, things start coming up, things start coming out. It hasn't been in recent times, but over there, once in a while, I had, in fact, years ago, I had a box sitting in the rectory office there, it had somebody's hand in it. And we don't know where it came from. And so I had to look at the cemeteries up, and they came out and we interned it somewhere. But those are the types of things that happen when you don't have a vault. And then the ground sinks, and if you've been in some of these cemeteries that aren't well kept, the ground's like this. And that's because the ground is sinking. So that's why they put these laws in to protect the deceased. And this is a marker here for James Murphy, who died in 1899. He's buried right next to the church with that Irish tradition. And tells you right here what he died from. I can't make that out articulate. What is it? Yeah. Anyway, Ginny Bozak, who was a granddaughter, she wasn't even born yet when he was already deceased, so she didn't get to know him. But they're buried right here. The Sullivans, the other ones that donated land to the cemetery, there's we're not sure if they're even buried at St. Mary's. During the 1940s, a group of men formed the Society for the Friends of the Poor Souls, a religious and social group. And being a men's group, where do you form these groups? You form them at the tavern, at Banks Tavern in Willow Springs. And the idea was that, you know, there are a lot of people buried in our cemetery when we start a men's group to collect money, to have masses said for the people. And so this was the beginnings of a men's social group. And I found this image on one of our old pictures, so we recreated it. We built that. Marty, you were involved in that. And we put this back up right there where it was. I get a little bit into cemetery symbolism with tombstones, and that could be a talk in itself, just on tombstones, the different eras, the different materials that were used, the different designs, the symbolism. It covers a whole array of things, but in this case, the image here is somewhat faded out now. It's a Sacred Heart and a fallen cross, symbolizing death, the fallen cross. One thing you'll notice in a lot of Catholic, if somebody was Catholic in a lot of cases, on the tombstone, they will ask for an intercession. Have mercy on me, pray for me, and they'll be asking for an intercession. And that could be at any cemetery, any place. And here's another idea of a fallen stone, a fallen cross. And if you look at the symbolism that's on the stones, and I just put a little brief thing up here because we could talk about all kinds of that. Flowers and plants remind us of the brevity of our lives. Egyptian flowers contain the key to divine power. So you can see roses on a lot of tombstones in their design, the fragrance. Seed pods and small buds are fragile beginning of life. Rosebuds and roses denote the passing of time. And the fern, humility, frankness, and sincerity of the deceased. And the laurel wreath, victory, eternity, and life. And the oak leaves are strength. So, and I'm just touching the surface on that kinds of stuff here. You can see some of this here. These are oak leaves here, and I'm not sure what this is over here. But you see that the whole idea on the tombstones. And a lot of times when you're studying the tombstones, you look at the tops. That tells you somewhat of what era that these was popular and what was for that time. And here's another one. Again, it's got the oak leaves and something else over here. Names the symbol for Christ. And one thing about the Irish, I don't know if I have an example here. The Irish, the old Irish, they would always put down what county they were from. And I always liked it. They would always put on their age, like age 62 or age 78. And I'm thinking, gee, that sounds like a piece of meat or something. It's age meat. And they put down age 62 and 5 months and stuff like that. Yeah. But I never checked it out, but there's probably every county in Ireland is probably in our cemetery. And then here's another era where the round one was in vogue. And here's one here, cirrhosis of the liver. And this is 1924. So I don't know how they can do. You got to start reading some of these death certificates. Well, I'll show you a couple that are unbelievable, but I don't know how much they knew about cirrhosis of the liver in 1924, but all I know is we used to say if he had cirrhosis of the liver, well, he drank. He was a drinker. That was the Irish one. And then you can see here in another stone, this one's made out of concrete, and you can see and then here's one here where they put a symbol of a religious And again, here's the fallen cross. And then sometimes the real old ones, and this goes back to the 19th century, they would put a cloth or a cover on it. Here's a rose we talked about, a curtain, a veil, a passage to conceal. Okay, this life is gone now, and the curtain has come down, the curtain is closed, we throw a veil over it now. This life is snuffed out. In fact, here's 1865 on that one. By the way, all these tombstones, Catholic Cemeteries does not own any of the tombstones. Here's something interesting about Catholic cemeteries. When you go in and you get a plot at Catholic Cemetery, you say, well, I bought a plot. You don't own it. All you bought was an easement. You bought a right to be buried. You bought a right to be buried in that spot. The Catholic bishop owns all the property and all the cemeteries. Right? The monument, you buy the monument, whatever monument you put up, whatever the regulations are, you put a monument up, that's yours. Okay, they have no responsibility to take care of the monuments. And they will take care of them in some cases where they can't account for who owns it anymore, who's even alive anymore, and if it becomes a safety hazard, they will take care of it. But this thing here will stand up until it corrodes and goes off into time, depending on what it's made out of. Unlike a secular cemetery, when you buy a plot there, you own it. You can sell it to whoever you want. Okay, if you decide in the Catholic cemetery, well, I bought these 2 plots here, but we're moving to Florida, so we're never going to use them, okay? You can only sell that back to Catholic cemeteries, and they will only give you what you paid for it. So if you bought it 20 years ago for $500, that's all you're going to get. $500. You're not going to get $2,000. And here's another idea here. This one here is really starting to go here, and you can see it here and then the roses here. And then the idea of a round one came in. Here's one I was talking about here, age 75 years. And then the wife here, 75 years. Some of them have been, newer stones have been put up by descendants in many cases. This is interesting, tree trunks. They came into vogue around 1890s till about 1900. And this one here had a cross on it at one time. It's broke off up here. But the whole idea there was that this life has been cut short. It's been cut out. It's just like you cut a tree down. The life's been cut out of this. So if you probably study who was buried in here, they probably died as a young person. Life has been cut out. By the way, 1900, in the year 1900, the average age of somebody dying in 1900 was, anybody want to take a guess?
30?
40. 1960, 65. That's where a lot of people, I think that's how they established retirement age at 65. The government likes it, by the way, for that. But 1960, the average age for a man was 65. So life expectancy in these days was short by our terms. The other thing is the tragedies in the cemetery. This cemetery is loaded with children. And it's loaded with people that have died from illnesses, things that we can simply cure today. If you were in the late 1880s, the middle 1880s, maybe even into the 1900s, if you had 10 children, you would hope that 5 of them would get to adulthood. And they would die from simple diseases, such as pneumonia. 1918, there was a big flu epidemic that came through. There's lots of people that died from the flu epidemic that came through. And that came back from Europe, from the soldiers returning from World War I. I think it started in Spain. And then here's one here that was a bench at one time. And the thought here is that you could come and you could sit next to the deceased there and, talk, maybe have some memories and talk about their lives. You know, the whole idea of the cemetery has changed. It has changed, and maybe some of you old timers here can remember, and I certainly can remember getting in the car with my grandparents on Sunday. We'd stop out at the cemetery and visit, and you'd spend some time in the cemetery, okay? And some people tell me they would come out there and have a picnic. And it was like a park. And that was the thought. They say that this cemetery was loaded with roses at one time, and you'd have that sweet smell of roses in and around this cemetery. And then things changed, and now it's like that's the place to stay out. And how many times when you're doing a little family history or something, you go, oh yeah, I know they're buried in the cemetery, but I don't remember where. You know, it was 25 years ago. That was the last time we even went and visited the grave to say a prayer, to pray for the deceased, to remember the deceased, you know. And and now they have all this crazy stuff going on with Halloween with the dead and the deceased. And we got all these lunatics. They come out to St. James. It's been quiet, relatively quiet the last few years. Running around, it looks like Night of the Living Dead. Sometimes out there with these people walking around out there. I don't know what they're looking for, and I believe if they really did see something, they'd probably take off running anyway. Here's something here. I was trying to decipher this. It looks like a little fern in here, and a cross. And with the fern, it would be honesty, frankness, and sincerity about this fellow here. And I just happened to find a picture of him, probably his wedding day. And he was employed at the stockyard. So when you put a face to a tombstone, it brings a reality to that, this is it, and in fact, it is somebody. And epitaphs. I love epitaphs, and some of them I just walking around in there. For surely the bonds of earth put out my hand and touched by the face of God. I have slipped the surely bonds of earth. Put out my hand and touched by the face of God. And this is a child, and it says on the bottom, it's biblical, it says, suffer little children, come unto me. And here's one here, it says, with Margaret here, and it says, our devoted friend. And I don't know, sometimes you wonder, should I put, you think of writing yourself, what's something on there or not, And here's one where they're asking for an intercession because as Catholics we believe in purgatory and all of that. And so here he's asking for an intercession. And here's a fellow here, you can barely read it anymore. He suffered long and murmured, not though far away, he's not forgot. The Lord does all things for the best, and took him home with him to rest. And that's an Irish fellow there. And there's a native there of County Kerry, with the little town. And here's another one asking for intercession. And this one I like, Mary Fitzpatrick. She was a gentle woman, and not to be outdone. Here's her husband, he was a good man. I don't know, maybe he was a saint living with her, I don't know. And this one I like the best. So Jack was also known for his sense of humor. And he's got this right on the stone right here. May the good Lord take a liking to you, but not too soon. Thanks for stopping by. So, you know, if you want to get one more in, that's the way to do it. So. Now, I also found interesting in the monuments that survive is the age of some of these people. Now, this Mary Monahan here, she was born in 1798. 1798. She lived till 90 years old. And I'm looking in the history of the country, and I noticed George Washington died in 1799, so she was born when he was alive. Sam Adams, Paul Revere, Thomas Jefferson, and then the Irish Rebellion in 1798. She was alive for all these things. And then there's some more of her family. It goes up this way. She's down there at the bottom. And I found even an older one. This Cody here, 94 years, 1786. Davy Crockett was born in 1786. When she was born, first newspaper published west of the Alleghenies, Shays Rebellion, and the missions in Santa Barbara were starting to be founded. I mean, that's just, you know, here they are right here. They're in this area. They're living in this area at this time. And then I got kind of fascinated reading obituaries and what I could find. And the cemetery, like I said before, it's loaded with tragedies. Untimely deaths, mishaps at work, shootings. It was like the Wild West out here at one time. And those that are into the Vermont history, I'll tell you one story that I pulled out of the newspaper. Here, with all these transient workers living here in the canals going on here, what do they call that down here? Was it Hell's Kitchen or Hell's Corner down here?
Smoky Row?
Yeah, Smoky Row was that down there. And it was, anyway, I pulled it out of the newspaper. It said that around that time, the town of Lamont, or Athens, passed an ordinance that all unmarried women had to be out of town by Friday. They tried to clean it up. So over by St. James, at that time, there was a little hamlet there. It was called Sagbridge, a little hamlet, and there was up to 800 transient workers living in the area. They were either working on the canal or they were working on the railroads, and there wasn't much law and order over there. And the barkeep, they loved it when all these women started coming over there to business went up. And here's a woman here. It says age 6 of Lyons over here, putrid sore throat. So I don't know, but that could probably be easily cured today. You know, the poor girl must have suffered immensely. This one here, I thought this was kind of interesting. 50 years old, she disappeared from her home around 6 o'clock last Thursday, was taken from a water-filled hole in a stone quarry at Sagbridge. She's believed to have drowned accidentally. She left home near the quarry to get 2 pails of water from a hole to wash clothes and failed to return. And the only comment I got there is at least she washed up and cleaned up before she died. Here's one here. In Canal Street, so that would have been, that could have been right here in Vermont. Shot and killed Dennis Hurley, known as Skinny, during an alteration. He frequently quarreled, although never coming to blows. Dean was behind the bar and refused to serve him. The argument followed. Culmination of shooting, the bullet pierced Hurley's right lung, and he staggered out of the saloon and fell on the sidewalk. That's right here in your town, not over there by us. And here's this one here I pulled out of the Trib. It says, it's a lot of police. There's a lot of police and civil servants also buried at St. James. A morning injury to his knee received while chasing a thief down a dark alley resulted in a blood poisoning which caused his death. He leaves a wife and 4 children, so I don't know, maybe a blood clot, I don't know what they could have, what could have happened. Was it
Infection.
some kind of, we probably had it before that even, who knows, yeah. He was instantly killed last week in Toledo, Virginia by the explosion of a box of dynamite. And here, right here from St. Patrick's Church, was the funeral. And his untimely death of this popular young man is deeply regretted. And friends followed the remains and found a resting place here at St. James. And that was in 1907. And this is the James Murphy, a switchman. He was killed on the Chicago area train engine, shot from injuries. He was age 42. And somehow he got mixed up there when they were hooking up train cars. And and that's what it talks about there. It says shock and injuries there. So, his death was a result of an accident Friday noon of last week while descending from a haymow. By reason of the rope, the hay knife fell upon him and pierced his side. He was removed to the hospital and died while submitting to an operation. Funeral occurred Friday from St. James. You know, I don't know if I have that slide in this one, but there was maybe I'll come across it. There was a fellow here around this time with the train tracks out there, and there were some kids playing on the train track, and it was an older gentleman, and the kids were throwing rocks and everything, and he's standing on the other train track, and he's yelling at them to get off the track, there's a train coming. Unfortunately, it was the track that he was standing on, and he got it. And he was so badly hurt, there was no hospital in Lamont, and I got this in a newspaper article, and it said, whatever somewhat of the doctor that they had at the time, he said, well, just take him home. You know, it was finished, take him home. He died in his parents' home last Friday. He had illness for 2 weeks, fatal complications. Here, 13 years old, so it's probably a simple disease that we could cure today. Sacred and the Mass was right here at St. James. Here's another one. This is great. This is one. We know that he was murdered, but by whom? This has remained an unsolved crime. He was alleged to have been shot in an assumed home invasion as he lay in bed beside his wife, Mary McMahon, at his home at 38th and Laurel, so that's in Chicago. And 17 years following Mrs. McMahon's considered us, Mary has remarried twice. Within that time, Mary has buried her last 2 husbands. So, all I have to say there is if you were married here, you better sleep with your eyes open. And here's the son. So you can see they talk about the fit of despondency. So it's things that are going on even today. And now this one I came upon by accident. And there was a fellow one day, he came out to St. James there. And sometimes people will come and they'll start asking me things. And sometimes I get curious myself. So, and I had one of those internet subscriptions to the newspaper archives. So I got interested in this whole Fitzpatrick scheme here. So I started digging around, and I found all kinds of stuff about this Fitzpatrick. They're all buried here. In fact, there was Donna Fitzpatrick at the time was being buried right here. And I'll tell you the story short. There was 4 Fitzpatricks. There was a father and 3 sons. All 4 fought in the Civil War. The father and the oldest son were killed in the Civil War. I don't know where they're buried. But the other son, the last 2 sons, James and Dennis. James became a battalion chief, fire chief in Chicago, 1893. The World's Fair was going on Stony Island. They had the cold storage building. And if you know anything about the cold storage building, this building was built, it's like a giant refrigerator in 1893 to store all the food for the World's Fair. And that building was enormous. It was a couple of blocks long, very tall, and it wasn't built exactly up to code because they built it in a hurry. And it was so big, the building actually had an ice skating rink in it. Can you imagine that? 1893, there was an ice skating rink in there. And there were frequent fires were breaking out in this building. So James Fitzpatrick, he's out there with his group fighting a fire. They get trapped in one of the towers in the top of the building, and there's no way out, and they all jump. It was either you burn up in the tower or jump, and he went into down the roof and he died from his injuries. So he's buried there in 1893. Now Dennis Fitzpatrick, his brother, 1896, he's 51 years old, and he's a police officer in Chicago. And one afternoon he has appendicitis attack. He's gone. That's it. He's dead. 54 years old. Luke Fitzpatrick was Dennis's son, who was named after the brother that was killed in the Civil War. 1906. He's a police officer. He walks in the middle of a holdup, and he ends up getting blown away. So he's gone. And so, just to show you, this whole section here is loaded with Fitzpatricks, and it's still an active burial site as of 2013. And so there's a lot going on there. And the deceased was one of our oldest settlers, and suddenly taken away, will be mourned by a host of relatives, funeral. Here again, St. Patrick's. Friday, and then brought over to Sag Bridge. He's buried right behind the church. James Delaney, he was by the Diamond Saw Company, and while at his post received the fatal injuries, he was in the act of mending a belt when he reached over his shaft, when a pin or key caught his coat, and he was wound up in his shaft, his body being mangled. And this is his monument here. There was a obelisk on the top at one time. And he leaves his wife and 2 children, a man of good habits and kind disposition. And Dennis O'Shea, a sad accident occurred Wednesday. He was a flagman for the Chicago-Alton Railroad, which is right here on Stevens Street crossing, was struck by a south pipe, so severely injured that his chances of recovery were doubtful at first. The ministry of kind friends and relatives was of no avail. He was an old resident of Lamont, and his host of friends deeply regret his sudden demise. So here's a fellow that came home from Cork, Ireland, about 30 years before that. And there you go. What is this? Bronchopneumonia. Yeah. So 6 months, 25 days. So, and that was 1899. Probably born at home. Somebody was probably sick at home. And then John Murphy, age 57, carbon monoxide poisoning. Let's see if I can find the date on that. 1917. I don't know how much they knew about carbon monoxide poisoning in 1917. I don't know what would be steam engines going. I don't know. Pardon me? Yeah, so I don't know what he was doing. I would say probably. See, it says carbon monoxide poisoning. So maybe with steam engines. And here's a fellow here. He was a resident of Woodlawn for 36 years. He served as a city detective for 20 years. He was in neighborhood affairs. His record during World War II, helping the sale of Liberty bonds and war drives, furnished a striking example of his patriotism. particular as he had 3 sons fighting in France. He came to Lamont by the way of Canada, and he did not have Lamont did not have a parish priest. His home was open to all priests and nuns, both Irish and German. Children were baptized in his home by the much-loved Father Bowman, who I mentioned was our first resident pastor around 1900. And he was a merchant for 50 years, a mayor and holder of other public offices. So it's probably here in Lamont. And Grand Marshal of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which is still around if you're Irish. And this guy here, he was quite a character, Dr. Benton. He was up here in Willow Springs. To make any difference what you had, if you were sick, you'd go see him, and he'd give you a shot of penicillin. Didn't make a difference. $10, you got a shot of penicillin. Off you went. And they say he was the last of the old country doctors, and he inoculated the Santa Fe workers during the 1936 smallpox epidemic, and he was notorious for undercharging his patients. I don't think you could say that about any doctor. And he was one of the charter members I talked about, the Poor Souls Society, so he hung out in the tavern as well. We only have 2 mausoleums in the cemetery itself. This particular one is, this one here, when you go to the bigger cemeteries like Mount Carmel, you see all those mausoleums, you would not believe what it would cost to build one of those. I mean, it would cost as much as to build a house, even in those times. And anyway, he's buried in the back there with his wife and that, and he worked for the Chicago Surface Lines as an electrical engineer, and they said he was a mathematical genius. He's buried in the back there. And of course, over the years with vandalism and everything else, it's boarded up. This is probably the most interesting person buried in our cemetery. David Brummer. He came from Canada. Has anybody been in the grocery store and they see those little rolled up things, Bremer biscuits?
Yes.
You put the little cheese on, that's him. All right, and he was the founder of Nabisco. The Bremer family is still around. They long ago sold it all over. Nabisco took over a long time ago. But the Bremer family is still around making those little biscuits. They live in Colorado now. But he came from Canada. He's a young man who went in the Civil War. And here it is. He's from Ottawa, Canada. Came to Chicago with his parents in 1848. 61, he was mustered into service. He established himself in the baking business, Cairo. After the Civil War, he supplied bread to the public. After the Great Chicago Fire, the bread was baked with his initials, David F. Bremer. People took it as damn fine bread. And stamped on the top, Bremer's bread became known as damn fine bread. Today, the company is known as the National Biscuit Company. And here's another, this guy here, Tony Dahlman. Tony Dahlman family has a long history in our person. You know Tony Dahlman? Did you know Tony Dahlman? Oh, just reading this. He was quite a character. You didn't know him, did you, Jim? No. Maybe Mark, you had him.
I knew all,
but anyway, he had to have, he had diabetes, he had to have his foot amputated, so he had it buried ahead of time in his grave, and he used to go, everybody had 1 foot in the grave. James Conway was born in County Kilkenny, and lived there until he came to America. He worked on a boat in the Mississippi, came to Lamont. He was a member of St. John's Parish one tribute paid him by a neighbor, William Bell, Bell Road. That his door was always open to the strangers and passing by. I don't know, maybe he was serving beer over there, I don't know. Laffy. This one here probably sums it up for me. They were men, and this is what he wrote before he died. They were men and women of simple faith, honest, industrious citizens, the type of which this country of ours was founded. But now, to our sorrow, more or less in the hands of brigands. The finest legacy a man may leave is the fact that he tamed the wilderness, built a home, raised a large family, educated them to the best of his ability, and started them in life with love and fear of God in their hearts, teaching them to be honest, industrious, and firm in their faith, and to maintain it at all costs. And I think that's kind of an inspiration for all of us as to what we would like to say about our families and our children and our grandchildren today. And some of the windows in the church have two names on it because there was two. One was the first line was when they were originally installed, and then this was a renovation that took place at some time. And many of those people are buried in our cemetery. And he was born in Ireland in 1831. He came to America in Willow Springs, another volunteer in the Civil War. And he was wounded by a gunshot in his skull. He was honorably discharged, and he died in Chicago in 1902. So all those years he ran around with a hole in his head from the Civil War. And I had not to digress, but I did, up in Canada, I had a great uncle there that he had gotten shot in the hip up in Edmonton, Alberta, back in about 1920, and they couldn't get the bullet out, and he used to sit funny all the time, because it was lodged right next to his artery. And so they were afraid to take it out. But, so I imagine there was something like that with him. This is one of our pastors, Father Rummer. He's not buried here. There his family is, I think it's his mother and his brother-in-law, or his brother and his mother. They're all buried there at St. James. This one I found interesting. This is the guy's name. Hilarious. Hilarious Smith. I didn't know there was such a name. He's been a funny guy. And this one got me too. Grover McGinnis, brother of Jesse, Frank, and James. So it says right here, he was the brother of Jesse, Frank, and James. So I don't know what that was all about. And this was a woman that was at our parish for many years, and she was in the Civil War roundtables, and maybe some of you know her or remember her. And she would write these little plays and skits and reenactments. Jim, is your wife here tonight?
Yeah.
Yeah. So she used to, his wife used to participate in a lot of them, and she had an untimely passing. And in fact, when they had the funeral at St. James, everybody dressed up in period costumes of the Civil War era. And you remember that? So it was kind of a nice tribute for her. She's buried in our cemetery. And there's the other mausoleum, just a very small one. And I don't have any information on this fellow. He was baptized, received his first Holy Communion, was confirmed at Sag Bridge. He obtained his early education at Sag School, attended Notre Dame in Indiana. Upon his death, he assumed the position of postmaster at Sag Bridge in his office. An office his father filled for many years. I don't think the post office was that busy in those days. No. They were probably playing checkers in there. I don't know. Nice government job. This one here is probably the biggest funeral we ever had at St. James. And he was church. And, so in the tradition of the old Irish priest who was buried next to the church in the home was German Marty.
Created a new plot.
Yeah, he created a new plot. That's what he happened. So good for him. Everybody says, well, how many priests or religious are buried in the cemetery? Stu. Father Aschenbrenner and then his father McManny. He was the founder of Little Flower, yeah. So he's buried toward the back there, 1966. And there's another one there. A Reverend Dudley Day's not buried there. There's nobody there. You see, he certainly should be dead from 1902. He's buried with his religious order. He was an Augustinian. So I don't know whatever's going to happen to that. There's nobody there. And then these lists, I've seen all kinds of, maybe some of you fellows and people here know more about. We try to track down all these Civil War vets and the war vets of the Lamont area and that. And several people over the years have submitted lists to us of people that participated in a lot of the wars. And of course, like many of the old cemeteries, we have veterans from every era. Spanish-American War, the Civil War, all different engagements. And I suspect that this certainly is probably just a partial list. And you can always tell the military person because this is government-issued stone with that on there. And so I just took a few pictures here just to show you. This was a fellow here from World War II, World War I. What I found interesting here is I actually found all of this, digging around with this guy. This really blew my mind. World War I. You're in the Army in World War I. The monthly pay was $36.60. All right? So this is like 1918, $36.60, and they took $6.70 out of it for insurance. So you actually went home with $29.90.
$1 a day.
Yeah, but $1 a day, right now. So you put your life on the line. And then there's just another, some other ones here. Nothing, I really don't have any comments on these. And these are veterans, and I was this was this particular standing up in this shape is generally for those of the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. And I can't really tell what's going on here with these. But I suspect that being that he's deceased in 1929, very likely that it's a GAR. And yeah, here's one here. In fact, here's one here, GAR right here. Grand Army of the Republic, Civil War, and it says organic heart disease. So what's organic heart disease? We work on that stuff. Is that for me, organic food or what? Organically wrong. This one here, it just said on here, he was a cook with the U.S. Army. And you can see here, like I said before, cemetery does not own any of the monuments, they belong to the families. And so a lot of them, the skinny ones especially, they've tumbled already. And you can imagine what's probably all written on here. And you can see how, nothing lasts forever. And you can see some more here. And here. And here's a little bit here. You can still, this one's in reasonably good shape. 1874. So, and then I found some pictures. That guy's there, not even at 60 years old.
Oh, wow.
All right? And that's just, so you can see in a lot of cases the hard lives that they had, and probably nutrition too, and other things, and the diseases and that. You know, it took a toll on some people. There's a couple more people, and some more people. Look at the eyes on her. I think that was a studio one. And look at this one here, 56 years old.
Oh, God.
Look at it. 1908, 56 years old. I like the hat, but the other one is probably shot in the studio. You don't see women wearing hats anymore. Maybe I missed it. No, okay, let's see.
That's your pictures.
Yeah, here's one here I just came across, and you can see this Mary Ellen Driscoll was installed here in 1945, and you can see when she got married, shot in the studio setting there, and that, when you put a face to a stone there, they become alive. They're, they're humans, you know. And this one here, this one cracks me up. He was the proprietor of James Tobin Saloon on Polk Street, Chicago West Side, and he was forced into early retirement when Prohibition was enacted. You'll figure that one out. That's what it said in the article. And there's a couple more death certificates. From shock received by falling to the ground from the top of an incline at Royal George Road located in Riverview Park. So I don't know what that's all about.
It was a roller coaster.
Yeah, so 34 years old, so he's probably having a gay old time there. Here's a poor little girl here. 1 month, 19 days, bronchitis against these simple diseases. Somebody was probably sick in the house at the time, because she's probably born at home.
Had a big cold.
Yeah, I like this one, cause of death, old age.
Oh,
There you go. What was this? She was 83 and, let's see the year up there somewhere. Does anybody see the year? Pardon me? 1907, so, she's old, so she died of old age. We don't know what she died of.
That's what they used to wear.
Yeah. Old
In the
enough.
70s.
Are all these death certificates kept at the church?
No, I found these from different sources.
Does the church keep any of them?
No. No, in terms of records of deaths, we don't keep those. No. You would more likely, you would get these from Cook County. Cook County would have a record.
Do they keep records of people being buried?
That, yeah, and it's hit and miss with Catholic cemeteries, how much they're going to give you. More than likely, they'll just give you the dates of interment. And that. This type of stuff you have to get from Cook County.
Excuse me, Deacon, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation.
I'm just about done, so. And
Very interesting.
Father Garrity was there back in the 1920s. He used to stand on the top of the hill and he'd say, didn't make a difference what nationality you were. He'd stand there and go, how's all my good Irish people there? And John Hurley, now this is the pauper section. This was in a newspaper article. He was a bigwig, this is exactly how it was written. He was a bigwig with the water company in Chicago, and and one of the main streets in downtown Chicago was closed for his funeral procession. And this was only done for people of high rank and notoriety. And he comes out to St. James and he's buried in the pauper section. So he comes out here, he's not a big deal out here with us. St. James.